Pues ahí estamos. Entonces estamos en la página 59 del libro y tenemos un refrán en el inglés que dice ladies first, ¿verdad? Así que, hermana, si usted comienza la lectura.
Con gusto. Kant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kant's agnosticism should be agnostic about it.
No. Since
human Kant.
Yes.
Should we be agnostic about it?
Okay. Immanuel Kant's impact has been even more devastating to the Christian worldview than David Hume's. For if Kant's philosophy is right, then there is no way to know anything about the real world, even empirically verifiable things. Why? Because according to Kant, the structure of your senses and your mind forms all sense data. So you never really know the thing in itself. You only know the thing to you after your mind and senses form it. To get a handle on this, look for a second out the window at a tree. Kant is saying that the tree you think you are looking at appears the way it does because your mind is forming the sense data you're getting from the tree. You really don't know the tree in itself. You only know the phenomena your mind categorizes about the tree. In short, you can't know the real tree in itself, only the tree as it appears to you. Why is it that the average person on the street doesn't doubt what he sees with his own two eyes, but supposedly brilliant philosophers do? The more we study philosophy, the more we are convinced of this. If you want to make the obvious seem obscure, just let a philosopher get a hold of it. Nevertheless, we can't avoid studying philosophy because, as C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy must exist. If for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. Kant's philosophy is bad philosophy, yet it has convinced many people that there is an unbridgeable gulf between them and the real world, that there is no way you can get any reliable knowledge about what the world is really like, much less what God is really like. According to Kant, we are locked in complete agnosticism about the real world.
Okay, let's stop there for a minute. It's interesting, whenever I was in seminary, the class, we did a class on this, and I wish the guy had, I wish this book had been written then, because we would have had a field day in that class. But the guy was saying, you know, you don't even know if you exist, because whenever you look in the mirror, are you really looking at yourself? Is that the real you, or is that what your brain is telling you that you look like? In other words, you could be an alien with two heads and colored green and eyes that sit up on the end of little stalks, but your brain reinterprets the information and gives you the image that you're looking at in the mirror. And likewise, looking at you guys, I'm seeing normal, healthy human beings, but am I really looking at the real images of you, or am I just reinterpreting by my brain? And that goes right across the board, whether it be this computer in front of me, whether it be this connection that we're having via the internet. Is it really happening, or is it just my brain making up a story? I don't know if you've ever heard or seen the movie The Matrix, but basically it's that's where that storyline comes from. the people are in a deep comatose state, and their brain is working out a normal, everyday experience of a human. But it was just fantasy, because we're all in this embryonic bubble being fed by tubes, etc. So it's a real mess. How do you know as you're crossing the road if the car is really coming down the road? Well, there's a sure way to find out. Walk in front of it and find out if it hits you or not. You know, it's absolutely ludicrous. But this is what the mind without Christ does. And the Word of God says very, very clearly, they, believing that they were intelligent, God gave them over to a reprobate mind.
Yes.
And they've just perverted their thoughts. But between Hume and Kant, those are the two main philosophical views that are being purported in our universities today. And our kids need to know about this before they're hit with it with no warning. Because it sounds so, well, how do you answer that, you know? And the fact that the Christians hitherto haven't had an answer to it means that it has just run rampant, and many Christians have fallen before it. But this guy is about to pull it apart, and pull it apart so simply that you'll laugh whenever you read it, okay? So let's do that now. Edgardo, would you like to continue the reading?
Sure. Thankfully, there's a simple answer to all of this. The roadrunner tactic. Kant commits the same error as Hume. He violates the law of non-contradiction. He contradicts his own premise by saying that no one can know the real world, while he claims to know something about it, namely that the real world is unknowable. In effect, Kant says the truth about the real world is that there are no truths about the real world. Since these self-defeating statements can stump even the sharpest minds, let's look at Kant's error another way. Kant is also making logical fallacy called the nothing but fallacy. This is a fallacy because nothing but statement imply more than knowledge. Kant says he knows the data that gets to the brain is nothing but phenomena. But in order to know this, he will have to be able to see more than just the phenomena. In other words, in order to differentiate one thing from another thing, you have to be able to perceive where one ends and the other begins. For example, if you put a white piece of paper on a black desk, the only way you can tell where the paper ends is by seeing some of the desk that borders it. The contrast between the paper and the desk allows you to see the boundaries of the paper. Likewise, in order for Kant to differentiate the thing in the real world from that which his mind perceives, he will have to be able to see both. But this is exactly what he says can be done. He says only the phenomena of the mind can be known, no the noumena, his term for the real world.
Okay, let's just stop there for a second. Are you following his argument? What was his first argument? The first one that he proposed against it.
Well, as I see, is that he's claiming that his philosophy is the only philosophy that sees the whole picture, right?
Okay. Yes.
That the
So,
real world
but in reality, what is happening is what the author says, right? Is to follow the road running tactic. How can he know that he's the only one?
how does he know that someone can't know?
Mm-hmm.
If you can't know, then how does he know? In other words, he shoots himself in the foot. That's point number one. And point number two, to be able to see the small picture, you have to be able to see the big picture. He's comparing two phenomena, the real world and the unreal world, to put it mildly. And he's saying, how can he say that if he claims that we can only see the non-realistic world? How does he know that he's only seeing the non-realistic world? To be able to make a comparison between what's real and what's not real, you have to be able to see both.
Right.
In other words, he wouldn't even be postulating, he wouldn't even be asking this question if he couldn't see both worlds. All right?
Yeah.
I remember Ravi Zacharias, he was talking, and a Calvinist got up and asked him the question about predestination. And he went through a whole spiel about God is all-knowing, he's sovereign, so therefore, blah, blah, blah. The typical Calvinistic line. And Ravi Zacharias said to him, the very fact that you're asking the question about being predestinated proves that you weren't predestinated. Because if you were predestinated, you wouldn't be thinking the way you're thinking. And he's doing exactly the same thing. He's saying, oh, I'm seeing something that's not real. Well, then that proves that what you're seeing is the real thing. Because you wouldn't be asking that question if it were a false world. You would just accept it. Everybody would be seeing their own phenomena and going about happily in their own lives, and nobody would be asking any questions. But the fact that we can see the real world, and he wants to deny the real world, then he has invented this figment of the imagination world, and he says that that is the real one. It's absolutely ludicrous. It's so subtle, it had to have come from Satan himself, you know?
Yeah.
So this is where the philosophy of relativity, relative thought comes from. So whenever you hear this statement, well, that may be true for you, but it's not for me. This is all rooted into this philosophy that everybody perceives what they want to see. So if you see it that way, well, then that's the way your brain works, and therefore that may be true for you, but my brain works a different way, and I see it a different side. So to be able to do that, they have to abandon the ultimate standard. And you and I as Christians, we have the ultimate standard, which is God's word. And anything that differentiates from that, we know is false. Why? Because we're looking at the real thing.
Yeah.
So whenever you do away with the real thing and you say the real thing doesn't exist, well then, you know, pigs fly and cows swim, and you can make the world into whatever you want to make it into. I'm not a man, I'm a girl. You're not a girl, you're a man. All of this stems from this line of philosophical thought. And it is so dangerous and so insidious, but it sets the sinner free from any ultimate goals or ultimate standards. He can do whatever he wants. In other words, Hitler was perfectly right, because Hitler and the Nazi movement, they saw the world in their own way. And according to them, they were right in what they did. Whenever a mother wants to abort her child, if she sees that as right, well, then that's the way she perceives the world. And who are you to tell her that she's wrong? And that it just spirals out of control. And if we're not careful, we're going to end up in a world like the Nazis, where they have a particular view, a particular group of people are hated and demonized and therefore destroyed. The Pol Pot system was exactly the same. Chairman Mao did the same thing. If you didn't see things the way he saw them, well, then you had to be done away with. And if our society doesn't watch out, that's the way this line of philosophical thinking is moving us. And it won't be very long. And really, brethren, whenever you look at prophecy and see the mind control that the Antichrist will have over the world, you can see where all these philosophical thoughts will feed in to that mind control situation. And they will be so malleable in his hand, he will be able to get them to see things completely differently from reality.
Yeah.
I think these two arguments, the first one is, it's the same as somebody says, well, no one can know the truth. Well, then how do you know that's true? Well, that's what he's saying. No one can know the truth. He's using very philosophical terminologies for it, but basically bringing it down, condensing it down to its main argument. He's saying no one can know truth. Well, how do you know that's true? You have to be able to know truth in order to know what isn't truth. And that's the second argument. So folks, we need to get a handle on it and read over these chapters again and again and again. And I would invite you, Brother Martin, to get your daughter to read these chapters, because I'm sure she has been hit with these philosophies in the university there in the States. And if Joshua is going to the States, I would recommend you to get him to read this book before he goes. We need to get this information into the hands of our young people so that they can see through it and be able to deal with it whenever it comes up. Okay, Martin, you want to pick up the reading?
Where did you stop?
Since these self-defeating statements.
Page?
If there's no way.
16. Page 60, the last paragraph.
Since these self-defeating statements.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pastor?
No, it's not. It's not.
In page 61, if there's no way.
Okay.
Okay, that's it, sister. You're right. I'm wrong. Sorry.
Okay. If there's no way to distinguish between the phenomena and the noumena, then you can't see how they might differ. And if you can't see how they might differ, then it makes much more sense to assume that they are the same. In other words, that the idea in your mind accurately represents the thing in the real world. What we're saying is that you really do know the thing in itself. You really do know the tree you are seeing because it is being impressed on your mind through your senses. In other words, Kant was wrong. Your mind doesn't mold the tree. The tree molds your mind. Just think about a wax. It's not the wax that impresses the seal. It's the seal that impresses the wax. There's no gulf between your mind and the real world. In fact, your senses are your windows to the world, and senses, like windows, are that through which we look at the outside world. They are not that at which we are looking. In a philosophy class in a philosophy class Norm was teaching, I pointed out the flaws in Kant's philosophy this way. I said, first, If Kant claims that he can't know anything about the real world, the thing in itself, then how does he know the real world is there? And second, his view is self-defeating because he claims that you can't know anything about the real world while asserting that he knows that the real world is unknowable. Well, one student blurted out, "No, it can't be that easy, Dr. Gisler. You can't destroy the central tenet of the last 100+ years of philosophical thought in just a couple of sentences." Quoting my favorite source, the Reader's Digest, I responded, "That's what happens when a beautiful theory meets a brutal gang of facts. Besides, whoever said that a refutation has to be complex? If someone makes a simple mistake, it only takes a simple correction to point it out. There's nothing complex about the road runner. He's simply fast and effective."
Very good. Very good. So what do you think of that, guys?
Mhm.
It's so, whenever you get the key to the puzzle, it's so easy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But whenever you're hit with it without being trained in your mind how to think things through, it really throws you through a hoop. You know, whenever I first read this way back in seminary, we didn't have an answer to it. We just said, that's the biggest load of nonsense we've ever heard. And that was the end of the story. But, you know, whenever you read this, it's so beautiful the way he just totally dismantles it with just a
Yeah.
couple of observations. So I would advise you, as I say, to read over, and read over that passage until you have the argumentation in your head and can refute it off the top of your tongue. Okay, human can't are wrong, so what? We're back to the ladies of the class. Sister.
Yes. Do you think that Yeshua can read,
Oh,
Pastor?
is Yeshua there? I didn't, sorry, I didn't see him beside you. Hey, there he is. Come on ahead, read this section.
Hume and Kant are wrong, so what? Since Hume and Kant violate the law of non-contradiction, their attempts to destroy all religious truths. However, just because Hume and Kant are wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have positive evidence for, say, the existence of God. The roadrunner tactic can only reveal that a proposition is false. It does not provide positive evidence that any particular claim is true. So it is true that a theistic God exists. Is there any knowable evidence that will give us reasonable certainty of one way or the other? Is there such a thing as knowable evidence for an unseen God? To answer those questions, we need to investigate how truth itself can be known. How is truth known? Let's sum up what we've seen so far. Truth exists, and it's absolutely undeniable. To say truth cannot be known is self-defeating because that statement would be a known absolute truth. In fact, anytime we say anything, we are applying that at least some truth because any position on any subject implies some degree of knowledge. If you say that someone's position is wrong, in order to show you can know what is wrong unless you know what. If you say I don't, you're admitting that know something else about the topic. Not that you don't know anything at all, but just how does one know? In other words, by that the truth, the process of evidence logic called first principles. They are called first principles because there is nothing behind them. They are not proved by other principles. They are simply inherent in the nature of the reality and are thus self-evident. So you don't learn these first principles. You just know them. Everyone intuitively know these principles, even if they haven't thought about them explicitly. Two of these principles are the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. We have already seen the reality and value of the law of non-contradiction. The law of excluded middle tells us that something either is or is not. For example, either God exists or he does not. Either Jesus rose from the dead or he did not. There are not third alternatives. These first principles are the tools we use to discover all other truths. In fact, without them, you couldn't learn anything else. First principles are to learning what your eyes are to seeing, just as your eyes must be built into your body for you to see anything. First principles must be built into your mind for you to learn anything. It is from these first principles that we can learn about reality and ultimately discover the box top to this puzzle we call life. Although we use these first principles to help us discover truth, they alone cannot tell us whether or not a particular proposition is truth. To see what we mean, consider the following logical argument. 1. All men are mortal. 2. Spencer is a man. 3. Therefore, Spencer is mortal. The self-evident laws of logic tells us that the conclusion, Spencer is mortal, is a valid conclusion. In other words, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. If all men are mortal and if Spencer is a man, then Spencer is mortal. However, the laws of logic do not tell us whether those premises and thus the conclusion is true. Maybe all men are not mortal. Maybe Spencer is not a man. Logic by itself cannot tell us one way or the other. This point is more easily seen by looking at a valid argument that isn't true. Consider the following. First, all men are four-legged reptiles. 2. Zachary is a man. 3. Therefore, Zachary is a four-legged reptile. Logically, this argument is valid, but we all know it isn't true. The argument is valid because the conclusion follows from the premises, but the conclusion is false because the first premise is false. In other words, an argument can be logically sound, but still be false because the premises of the argument do not correspond to reality. So logic only gets so far. Logic can tell us that an argument is false, but it cannot tell us by itself which premises are true. How do we know that Zachary is a man? How do we know that men are not four-legged reptiles? We need some information to discover those truths. We get that information from observing the world around us and then drawing general conclusions from those observations. When you observe something over and over again, you may conclude that some general principle is true. For example, when you repeatedly drop an object off a table, you naturally observe that the object always falls to the floor. If you do that enough, you finally realize that there must be some general principle in place known as gravity.
Okay, let's stop there for a wee minute. He's going through here how we can know truth, and he's talking about terminologies that we need to be able to explain. Premises. Can anyone tell me what a premise is? What's a premise?
Actually, let me see if in this way I can answer your question. If I got it right, for instance, the argument is gonna be the chain which you use to get to a premise. You can have a sound argument, but even though the argument makes sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that the premise is correct. So actually here, the premise is the ultimate truth we're looking for.
Okay, very good. And so a premise is the base argument on which a philosophy or a teaching is formed.
Yeah.
For instance, if the if someone comes to you and say, well, homosexuals can't help it, they're born that way. So they're basing their argument for homosexuality on the premise that all homosexuals are born homosexual. And that's not true. And there is no evidence, no scientific evidence whatsoever that there's anything close to a homosexual gene. It is a life choice. It's something that people decide whether they want to do or whether they don't want to do it. They're not born that way. The way we can prove that our argumentation is false is that if I were born with a tendency to rape women, could I then say, well, it's not my fault, I was born that way? Well, whether you were born that way or whether you weren't born that way, raping a woman is wrong. I heard, I think it was Ray Comfort, he said to a guy in the streets, he said, I was born attracted to women. But he said, I'm married, and even though I may find other women attractive, I know that it would be wrong to follow that attraction to its ultimate conclusion. And he says, we're all born with attractions. We're all born with desires. But just because we're born with a desire in a particular direction doesn't mean to say that we take the brakes off and go after it. There is a thing called right and wrong, and things that we intuitively know. Intuitively means that it's something that's inborn in our DNA. We know it to be true, even though we've never seen it and we've never taken a vote on it in a democratic society, but we know it's true. For instance, we know that it's true that we shouldn't torture babies for fun. We know that it's true that Jews shouldn't be put into gas chambers just because they're a Jew. There's certain things that we know intuitively from our DNA. We as believers would say that it's the spark of divinity within us, the knowledge of God and his moral law that is just present in us. Nobody ever teaches us it, but we know that it's there. And so what we have to do whenever somebody comes with an argumentation is go back to their baseline premise. And if the baseline premise or thought is erroneous, then no matter what way they construct their argumentation logically, it'll fall down. And it's the same in the construction industry. If you don't put the right foundation in, it doesn't matter how beautiful the building looks, it will fall down. I was watching a program on TV the other day, and it was about these guys that go in and demolition crew, and they implode buildings so that it falls down on its own floor pattern. And they were called in to deal with a high-rise block of apartments on the shore of one of the rich areas of California. And it was interesting. It had never been used. And why? They had put, I think it was something like 450 million into this project. And whenever they were starting to put the windows and everything in, they discovered a mistake in their calculations for the foundations. And they had to bring it down because they said the first hurricane that would come in, it would have fallen flat like a pack of cards. It would have been, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Why? Because they got the calculations for the foundation wrong. And that is a premise for making good argumentation, is that your baseline argument, your baseline thought is as solid as a rock. It cannot be challenged. And if it cannot be challenged, and your reasoning is logical, that you build on top of that initial premise, then your argumentation will stand against any storm of argumentation that comes against it. So that's what he's saying. The structure of an argument may be impeccable, but if the baseline thought that starts it off is wrong, well, then the whole thing just falls flat. Okay?
Okay.
So that argumentation that, what was it, Zachary, is a four-legged reptile? Well, that's the same argumentation that the homosexuals use, the gay community use, etc., to justify their line of argumentation. And Kant's whole thing comes into it. So if somebody's imbibed into Kant's philosophy and they say, well, I'm seeing a man in the mirror, but really I'm a woman. So therefore, I'm a woman, but I don't have the genitalia to a woman. So therefore, it isn't necessary for the female gender to have genitalia. You know, if you listen to them arguing on the TV and you know Kant's argumentation, you can see right through it right away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they also use circular reasoning. And they start off with their initial premise and then they come back to their initial premise. And it's crazy. It's crazy. But if we get the code and are able to break into this way of thinking, then we can blow it open and show the people the ludicrousy of their statements. Let's read on, guys, and see if we can glean anything else. Where are we? I've lost myself again.
Page 64, this method. Second
Okay, well,
paragraph.
back to you, Monica.
Okay. This method of drawing general conclusions from specific observations is called induction, which is commonly equated with the scientific method. In order to be clear, we need to distinguish induction from deduction. The process of lining up premises in an argument and arriving at a valid conclusion is called deduction. That's what we did in the arguments above. But the process of discovering whether the premises in an argument are true usually requires induction. Much of what you know by induction. In fact, you've already used induction intuitively to investigate the truth of the premises in the arguments above. Namely, you determined that since every man you've observed has been a two-legged mammal, the man Zachary cannot be a four-legged reptile. You did the same thing with the question of Spencer's mortality. Since all men you've heard about ultimately die, you made the general conclusion that all men are mortal, including a specific individual man named Spencer. These conclusions, two-legged man, gravity, and human mortality are all inductive conclusions. Most conclusions based on induction cannot be considered absolutely certain, but only highly probable. For example, are you absolutely 100% certain that gravity makes all objects drop? No, because you haven't observed all objects being dropped. Likewise, are you absolutely certain that all men are mortal? No, because you haven't observed all men die. Perhaps there's someone somewhere who hasn't died or will not die in the future. So if inductive conclusions are not certain, can they be trusted? Yes, but to varying degrees of certainty. As we have said before, since no human being possesses infinite knowledge, most of our inductive conclusions can be wrong. there is one important exception. It's called the perfect induction, where all the particulars are known. For example, all the letters on this page are black. This perfect induction yields certainty about the conclusion because you can observe and verify that every letter is indeed black. But even when we don't have complete or perfect information, we often have enough information to make reasonably certain conclusions on most questions in life. For example, since virtually everyone has been observed to die, your conclusion that all men are mortal is considered true beyond a reasonable doubt. It's 99+% sure, but it's not beyond any doubt. It takes some faith, albeit a very small amount, to believe it. The same can be said for concluding that gravity affects all objects, not just some. The conclusion is practically certain, but not absolutely certain. In other words, we can be sure beyond a reasonable doubt, but not sure beyond all doubt.
Okay, so what's he talking about there?
I liked Pastor that how he made the difference between induction and deduction. Deduction in its simplest form is through induction we draw. It says here the method of drawing general conclusions from a specific observation is called induction. But the process of discovering whether the premise is an argument are true usually requires induction. So not from deduction we try to go forth and look for the truth. It's actually from induction.
Okay. So induction is gaining information. Yeah. Deduction is what you conclude from that information that you've gleaned. Mm-hmm. So if your inductive process is incomplete, your deduction from that process cannot be complete. So in other words, whenever we say we believe in God, we haven't been on every planet in the universe. We haven't been on every star. We can't be in every place at the one time. So therefore, our inductive process of gaining information for the existence of God is limited. So we cannot say that I know for 100% sure that God exists. But with the same factor, the person who says God doesn't exist cannot be 100% sure. He's never been on every planet in the universe. He's never been in every star. He can't be in every place at the one time, looking in every direction at the same time. So therefore, his inductive process is incomplete. He cannot say categorically that God doesn't exist. But we can gain enough evidence to have what we call a reasonable, beyond reasonable doubt. Yeah. Whenever you're watching the movies where they're doing a trial, and the trial is to put a man away for life imprisonment or the death penalty, the judge will instruct the jurists that they must come to a conclusion that is beyond reasonable doubt. Because it's impossible to know 100% unless you were there during the whole event. We as outsiders, receiving witnesses, receiving forensic information, we deduct from that information that we're given that the guy is guilty. But what is the percentage of certainty that he is guilty? Well, the certainty is beyond a reasonable doubt. and they reckon that if you get to 75% and up, you're in the realm of beyond a reasonable doubt. And this is a good premise to make, because whenever young people, especially with the university and Kant's philosophy and everything else, they come up to you and they say, how do you know God exists? You know, and that's one of the major questions that they're going to ask us. And we need to have at our fingertips the argumentation for the existence of God. And this book goes into great detail on those evidences. But at the end of the day, they're going to say, well, you can't know for certain. And you can go back to them and say, well, you can't know for certain that he doesn't exist. For the very same reasons that you reject my affirmation that God does exist, I can reject your denial on exactly the same premises. No one can know anything 100% unless the inductive information is complete. And it's very, very rare in society and in our everyday life that we do have 100% information. 100% information saying that the words in this page are black is a very, very simple area of study. But usually the great questions of life are a lot more complicated on what color are these letters, you know? But if you were to go on and say, all the letters on this page are black, and this page is part of a book, so therefore all letters on all pages in all books must be black. That is a fallacy. That is a fallacy waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Because we've never seen all the books in the world. Maybe some book has yellow letters or red letters. I have one here. I'll just show it to you now. I love it whenever you're using illustrations. There you go.
Yeah.
All the letters on that page are in black. So you see, for someone to make a statement without having looked at every single book in the world, that would be pretty dumb. And yet people will say that God doesn't exist. And how dumb is that, you know? And so we're on an even playing field with these people. And you know, they're in the same sense, we cannot be 100% sure that evolution didn't happen, but they cannot be 100% sure that it did. In fact, our inductive information tells us 75% or more that it didn't happen, and their inductive information would maybe be about 1%.
Yeah.
You know, so whenever we look at the percentage or the overall weight of their argumentation, we find that the atheists are very light on their side of the scale when it comes to weight of argument. And that's why this guy and the others, and there's a spat of them have come forward. And they're coming out with these wonderful logical argumentations, and they're throwing the younger generation into a spin, because all of their parroted narratives that they've learned from their philosophy teachers, it's just falling flat on the ground and leaving them high and dry. And it's great if we can get our young people to understand this and be able to use it whenever they come up against it in university. Yeah. Okay, guys, what page are we on now? My book closed.
Page 65, the title, How Are Truths About God?
Okay, how are truths about God known?
Yeah.
That's where we are. Okay, Martin, would you like to read another passage for us? Guys, there's only 3 more pages left in this chapter. Do you would you have time to finish them?
Yeah, we should.
Oh, Pastor.
Yeah.
I thought that my microphone was on, but it was off.
Okay.
I was saying that I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
2 things. What you're saying is that what happens in a courtroom, for example, is an induction for the jurors.
It's
is that
they
right?
are given inductive information
Right.
that is gleaned and
Right.
presented, but they must make a deduction of everything that they've received.
Yeah, and they are given the induction from the prosecutors and the defender lawyers also, right?
Yeah, yeah. They're getting positive inductive information and negative inductive information, pro and against. And then they
I never thought about it.
They have to take all of that and make a deduction.
Yeah, I had never thought about it, but as you know, as a term of induction, and that's really what is happening in a courtroom, right?
Yeah.
That's amazing, powerful to know.
Well, it's the same even in church. You know, whenever I'm preaching, you guys, I'm inducting you with the information. You're receiving it via induction. You're listening through your ears, through your eyes. Communication is a complex system of facial expressions, tone of voice, and words. And so we're hearing and we're seeing. And all of that comes together. That's why it's so easy to deduce from a text message something that's not right. You know, you could text something to somebody and they would take offense at it. And you're at the other end and you're saying, what's wrong with this guy? But he's only receiving, they reckon that the actual words that we write or speak represent 10% of the communication. The rest is made up in facial expressions and tone of voice. A phone is better because we're getting more information. We're getting the tone of voice and we're getting the words. But the like of this Zoom communication, we're getting the whole picture. We're getting the tone of voice, we're getting the information, and we're also getting the facial expressions. And so it's very, very important. So that inductive process, whenever you're preaching, and that's why, you know, we have to be careful with our tone of voice, guys, because if we're communicating something that is tender and would hurt people, like you're a sinner, we have to use a tone of voice that allows the person to understand, I'm telling you some information here, but I feel for you, you know? And that's why we can introduce it by saying, I don't want to offend you, but the Bible says we're all sinners. We've all fallen short of the glory of God, you know, and things like that in order to help the person receive the information and not deduce a negative message in the gospel. So it's a wonderful process. And it's something that we can use to full advantage for communicating the gospel.
Amen.
Okay, Martin.
There's something. There's something else that I'm just trying to make conclusions on my mind, and something that happens on youth people who goes to the university, and even for me, I think that whenever we get into a talk with an atheist or this kind of people, I have to acknowledge that I lost the focus. As we're reading in this book, I'm not sure, but I think the best that we can do is to focus on premises, because premises are the basis. If we have the ability to recognize where the premises are coming from, I think we will know, how to debate. What do you think?
Yeah, very much so. What do you think, Edgardo and Monica? How do you guys see it?
Well, it's the same. I can see the same thing that Martin is saying. I don't know what you were saying about, but I have a question though. When you say of inductive conclusions and deductive conclusions, what if an atheist, right, comes to you and tells you there's no God, right, and God doesn't exist, and he will lean to the inductive conclusion or to the deductive, because we need to be prepared in that scene as well. I was thinking that, because imagine if just for example, if I haven't read all the Bible per se, and he asks me something about it, I don't know if you understand what I mean. So we have to be prepared, or they have just a way to go through with inductive and deductive conclusions. Okay. I don't know if I.
No, it's valid what you're saying. Both of you are saying the same thing. Depending on what a person has received, that forms their baseline premise. And then they build their lives argument, their worldview is the terminology we use. They build their worldview on top of that foundational premise. And so whenever we're talking to someone, we have to find out where they're coming from. And that's where the questions come in. What do you mean by that? Where do you get that from? How did you come to that conclusion? And that gives the person the opportunity to come out with, well, my professor says, or my mother says, or this, that, or the other. And then we can, once we know where they're coming from, if we need to ask more questions to chase it back even further, we can do that. But if we're satisfied that we know where they're coming from, then we can ask them, have you ever considered this? Have you ever thought about this interpretation? If a person says to you, there is no God, well, we can say to them, what do you mean by that? Well, I don't believe in a God with a long beard sitting on the clouds up there. Guess what? Neither do I. But that's not the God I'm talking about. And so you can push them and bring out what it is that they're basing their argumentation upon. And once we get to the core argument of the core basis, then if we can recognize the fallacy of that basis, we can point it out to them, and their whole argumentation falls. So whenever somebody says, well, you can't know any truth, well, what do you mean by that? Well, you can't stand up there and say that you know truth. Well, how do you know that what I'm saying is not true? And we can use the Roadrunner tactic, or we can use the Columbo tactic that I talked about in the church service of the ambassador, and we can punch holes in their thought process until the whole thing just falls flat on the face. And it is wonderful, guys, and really it is. It is I wish I'd got this book and the next book that we're going to study, Tactics. I wish I had got it 20, 30 years ago at the beginning of my ministry, because I would have been more powerful in my argumentation and presentation of the gospel than what I am now. But that wasn't the design of the Lord. He didn't inspire these guys to write these books until now.
Yeah.
And that's what, pardon, Edgardo, go on.
No, I was just going to say something quick, that all the theory that we're reading right now, I already understood, but I'm fascinated about easy examples. For instance, the prosecutor and the pastor are given inductions. The jury and the sheep or the church make deduction. So that sums up all the theory we're reading right now. So sometimes, for me, it's much easier to remember, to understand things with easy examples, So fast.
Amen. And sometimes I find in my ministry, sometimes I'll preach something and somebody will come up to me later, maybe even a couple of months, even a year later, and they'll say, no, whenever you were preaching, you said that, and I think this, that, and the other. And I'll go, what are you talking about? That wasn't what I was saying. So their hearing and their interpretation of what they're hearing affects their deductive process. So I was in a church once where I had a problem with a guy. The guy had been quite confrontational in Lanzarote. And whenever I was preaching, actually, it happened in Northern Ireland as well, in Belfast, but I'll give you this illustration from Lanzarote. Whenever I was preaching, the friend of this guy came up to me and said, I don't think it was very nice of you preaching at so-and-so. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, you were preaching at him from that verse of scripture. And I opened up the scripture, and I like to preach through passages of scripture. So say I had the argumentation with the guy on the Friday, my sermon was already in its embryonic stage, waiting to be put together, but the passage and the text was already in the book. Everybody in the church knew that I would be preaching from that chapter. And I just turned the Bible around to him and I said, can you show me another application of God's word? To make that accusation, his inductive information was my words from the pulpit plus what his friend had told him had happened on Friday night.
Right.
So therefore, he mixed those two informations that he was receiving, and he deduced from that I was taking advantage of the pulpit to get at his friend. And I can assure you there would be nothing further from my mind. But we need to be very, very careful whenever we're communicating information, because it's not just ourselves that is giving information to people. They're getting information from everybody that they come in contact with. And so it can get a mixed message. So that's why it's always good that you have an open policy. Listen, if you haven't understood something or something I've said has made you think or made you angry, I'm available after the church service during the week. Give me a call. We'll sit down and talk it through. And I think with that open door policy, there should be no reason why someone who is offended or hurt or confused wouldn't seek help to sort that out. you know?
Right?
So it's good to be able to talk.
Pastor Martin, were you going to say something?